Officer Nolan Greaves patrolled his usual beat, scanning the park with his sharp, well-practiced eyes. He'd walked these grounds for years, long enough to know almost every face in the neighborhood. Today, though, a particular man named Kai Lancaster caught his eye, a calm, confident figure seated alone on a bench. A stranger. Nolan frowned. Something's off, he thought. The man was too composed, too unbothered. His gut stirred with suspicion, a feeling he'd come to trust over the years. He'd heard rumors of a recent suspect in the area, someone matching a vague description. Was this the man? Nolan muttered to himself, never seen him around here before. As Nolan continued to watch Kai, he became more convinced that the man's calm demeanor meant he had something to hide. He's too relaxed, Nolan thought. He'd seen too many situations where the quietest ones were the most dangerous. Kai, feeling a pair of eyes on him, looked up from his book. Across the park, he noticed the officer staring. His heart sank. He'd seen that look too many times before, the suspicion, the quiet judgment. But he refused to let it unsettle him. Kai closed his book calmly, resting his hands on the cover. He met Nolan's gaze, unflinching. Nolan tightened his grip on his baton, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling of being stared down by someone who didn't seem the least bit afraid. After a brief hesitation, he began walking toward Kai, each step filled with a determination that he couldn't quite explain. "Afternoon," Nolan said, stopping just in front of the bench. Kai looked up, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Afternoon, officer. What brings you out here today?" Nolan asked, his tone polite but laced with suspicion. Kai kept his voice steady. "Just enjoying the park. It's a nice day." Nolan wasn't convinced. He could feel Kai's calmness as a challenge, an unspoken defiance. "Are you from around here?" he probed, his eyes narrowing. Kai gave a faint, non-committal smile. "I've been around." He knew his answer wasn't satisfying, but he didn't owe this officer an explanation. The response made Nolan uneasy, pushing his hand closer to his baton. "Mind if I see some ID?" Kai's smile faded. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his tone steady but firm. Nolan stiffened at the question. There was that calmness again, the refusal to show fear. It grated on him, made him feel like he was losing control of the situation. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Nolan shot back, his hand drifting closer to his holster. Kai took a measured breath, sensing where this was heading. "I'm just sitting in a park, officer," he replied. "Is there a law against that?" Nolan's patience was thinning, and his pride wouldn't let him back down. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he insisted, though the excuse sounded flimsy even to him. He stepped closer, his posture tense and confrontational. Kai remained still, his gaze unwavering. "And what description would that be?" Nolan's jaw clenched, realizing he didn't have a good answer. He wasn't about to admit that, though. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Show me some ID now." The two men locked eyes, the tension thick between them. Kai knew he could push back, assert his rights, but he also knew that refusing could make things more dangerous. Not today, he decided. He reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out his wallet and handing his ID over to Nolan. Nolan barely glanced at the ID before snapping. "Stand up." Kai's heart sank, but he rose from the bench slowly, keeping his hands visible. He could feel eyes on him from around the park, people watching the unfolding scene. Nolan stepped back, taking out his handcuffs. "Turn around," he ordered. Kai exhaled a slow breath but didn't resist as Nolan cuffed him. He stayed calm, though inside, frustration simmered. He knew what would come next, and he was ready. Nolan gripped Kai's arm tightly, leading him toward the patrol car as if he just caught a hardened criminal. Kai walked in silence, his gaze steady as they passed by parkgoers who watched with varying expressions, some with pity, others with curiosity, and a few with judgment. Kai's mind was already turning to what lay ahead. They'll figure it out soon enough. As they drove toward the precinct, Kai sat silently in the back seat, his wrists sore from the tight cuffs. He looked out the window, watching the trees and buildings blur past, his mind elsewhere. In the front seat, Nolan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He kept stealing glances at Kai in the rearview mirror, unsettled by the calmness in the man's eyes. When they reached the precinct, Nolan brought Kai inside, his steps brisk and determined. He processed Kai's arrest paperwork without a second glance, unaware of the storm he was about to unleash. When Nolan finally sat down to check Kai's ID thoroughly, he felt his stomach drop. Kai Lancaster, FBI? He stared at the screen, his mind racing. He just arrested a federal agent. Nolan scrambled to keep his composure, his hands shaking slightly. Mr. Lancaster, I apologize. This is a misunderstanding. Kai watched him, unamused. A misunderstanding? His tone was calm but laced with frustration. It didn't feel like that. With Kai's position revealed, Internal Affairs stepped in, launching an investigation. The precinct buzzed with whispers, officers exchanging wary glances. The tension in the precinct grew thick as officers became aware of Nolan's mistake. They knew this was no minor incident. It didn't take long for the story to break. Reporters were camped outside the precinct, hungry for details about the FBI agent wrongfully arrested. Kai's face was all over the news, and every network wanted a statement. The public backlash was fierce, and protests began to simmer. Inside the precinct, Nolan felt the weight of each passing hour. His colleagues avoided eye contact, and whispers filled the hallways. Kai's presence was a constant reminder of the mistakes that had been made. The pressure was building, and he knew it was only a matter of time before things erupted. Internal Affairs upped their investigation, scrutinizing Nolan's entire record. His past cases, reports, and arrests were being pulled apart, looking for any sign of bias or misconduct. Every time he passed the conference room, he could see agents with stacks of files bearing his name. The head of I, a steely woman named Agent Reyes, finally called him in. "We've received multiple complaints about your conduct over the years." Officer Greaves. "Do you want to explain?" Nolan stammered, feeling the sweat on his brow. Those were misunderstandings. "Like this one?" Reyes asked, her gaze icy. Kai was done playing it cool. After years of experiencing incidents like this, he'd reached a breaking point. He filed an official complaint, not just against Nolan but against the entire precinct for fostering an environment of prejudice. He knew the complaint would spark a firestorm, but he didn't care. "I'm tired of this," he said in a meeting with his lawyer. "They're not getting away with it this time." His lawyer nodded, readying the paperwork. "This isn't just about you anymore. People are watching." The protests had grown louder, and the precinct became a focal point for local activists. Crowds gathered outside daily, holding signs and chanting for justice. It became impossible to ignore. News vans were stationed around the clock, broadcasting the protests live. Inside the precinct, officers felt the pressure. Nolan could hardly leave the building without facing a barrage of shouts and insults from the crowd. He felt trapped, with nowhere to turn. Nolan's previous cases were coming under new scrutiny. Stories surfaced about people he'd detained without probable cause, all of them eerily similar to what happened with Kai. Each story added fuel to the fire, painting a picture of an officer who had a history of profiling and overstepping his bounds. When he read the news articles, Nolan felt a pang of fear. His entire career was unraveling. The precinct finally arranged a private meeting between Nolan and Kai, hoping to calm the situation. In a small, tense room, they faced each other across a table, a silent battle raging in the air between them. Nolan cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "Look, Agent Lancaster. I didn't know who you were." Kai's expression hardened. "So if I'd been anyone else, that would have been okay?" Nolan faltered, feeling his defenses crumble. He had no response. The other officers in the precinct began to take sides. Some felt that Nolan had crossed the line and should face consequences, while others believed he was being treated unfairly. Arguments broke out in the locker room, and old loyalties were tested as the precinct was forced to confront its own biases. One of Nolan's closest friends, Officer Daniels, approached him after a particularly heated argument. "This is bad," Nolan, Daniels said. "People are starting to turn against you. You need to make this right." Nolan looked away, unable to face the truth. Kai was at a crossroads. His lawyer advised him to press forward with a lawsuit, one that would likely expose not only Nolan but the entire precinct. But Kai was weary, knowing that a prolonged legal battle would take its toll. "Why should I be the one to carry this burden?" he asked his lawyer. "Why should I have to fix their mess?" "Because, Kai," his lawyer replied, "you have the power to make a change that could save someone else from going through this." Nolan could no longer ignore the impact of his actions. With every protest chant, every news headline, his shame grew. His family began to distance themselves, not wanting to be associated with him. At home, his wife gave him the silent treatment, and his teenage son avoided him altogether. One night, alone in his kitchen, Nolan buried his face in his hands. He'd built his life on pride and authority, and now it was all crumbling. Amid the turmoil, an unexpected figure reached out to Kai, Captain Morales, Nolan's superior. Morales was one of the few officers who'd openly criticized Nolan's actions, and she offered to support Kai in his fight. "I know the kind of officer Nolan is," she told Kai. "I want to help you take this precinct in a new direction." Kai looked at her, wary. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I'm tired of watching this happen," Morales replied, her voice resolute. Higher authorities began to apply pressure on the precinct to take action. The police chief, facing a potential public relations disaster, held a tense meeting with Captain Morales and other department heads. "If we don't do something soon, this will bring the whole department down," the chief warned. "We need a scapegoat. And it's looking like it'll be Greaves." Morales left the meeting determined to overhaul the precinct's culture. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. After weeks of investigation, Internal Affairs announced their findings. Nolan was found guilty of racial profiling and abuse of authority. They recommended a suspension, pending a final review. The news brought mixed emotions for Kai. It was a victory, but it felt hollow. He knew that a suspension wouldn't erase the pain he'd endured, nor would it prevent future incidents. Nolan was suspended without pay, his badge and gun taken away in a publicized ceremony that was as much about optics as it was about justice. As he walked out of the precinct for what could be the last time, he faced a gauntlet of reporters and protesters, their voices echoing in his mind. The shame was crushing, but part of him still refused to admit his fault. The media frenzy continued, with debates raging on talk shows and social media. Some defended Nolan, arguing that he was a scapegoat for a larger issue, while others called for more reforms and accountability in the police force. Kai watched the debates unfold, feeling both empowered and exhausted. Kai returned to Riverside Park, sitting on the same bench where it had all started. He looked around, the place no longer feeling as peaceful as it once had. The ordeal had changed him, made him see the world differently. But as he watched children playing and people enjoying the park, he knew he'd done what was right. Even if it meant losing a part of his own peace. Not everyone is happy with how Kai handled the situation. Some in the community feel that he should have let it go, fearing that his actions would only bring more attention and scrutiny to black citizens in the area. Others see him as a hero for standing up against injustice. This divided support weighs heavily on Kai, making him question if he's done the right thing. Suspended and facing an uncertain future, Nolan begins to examine his own life. He reaches out to Captain Morales, asking her how he can start to make things right. Morales, skeptical at first, suggests he start by attending local community meetings to listen and learn. Nolan agrees, even though he knows it'll be uncomfortable. His first meeting is tense. Community members recognize him and aren't shy about their feelings. But instead of walking out, he stays and listens to their experiences. Slowly, he begins to understand just how deep the pain and mistrust run. Given the media attention, Kai is invited to speak at events and on talk shows, where he shares his story to raise awareness about racial profiling. While this visibility is empowering, he quickly realizes the toll it's taking on his personal life. Every public appearance feels like reliving the trauma, and he begins to wonder if he can continue putting himself through it. The increase in media attention has put Kai under a harsh spotlight. Anonymous threats begin to arrive, warning him to stay quiet and move on. One night, he finds a threatening note pinned to his car's windshield. The FBI takes the threats seriously, assigning him protection, but the fear of harm to himself and his family lingers. The investigation exposes deep divisions within the precinct. Some officers are relieved that Nolan is being held accountable, while others view him as a scapegoat. Tensions rise as officers take sides, with arguments breaking out in the locker room and some even refusing to work with each other. Captain Morales finds herself at the center of it all, trying to maintain unity while pushing for reform. Kai's parents reach out, concerned about the toll this fight is taking on him. They worry about his safety, his mental health, and his future in the FBI. In an emotional conversation, they urge him to think carefully about whether this fight is worth everything he's sacrificing. Kai is torn between his love for his family and his commitment to justice, knowing there's no easy answer. Determined to make things right, Nolan asks to meet with Kai again. Kai is hesitant but agrees, hoping for some closure. In their conversation, Nolan attempts an apology, admitting that he made assumptions based on bias. Kai listens, his face expressionless, but he doesn't immediately accept Nolan's apology. Instead, he tells Nolan that real change requires more than words. It's about changing systems, not just individuals. With Kai's story sparking national attention, the local community pushes for a comprehensive reform of the police department. They demand bias training, community oversight committees, and better accountability measures. The push for change is met with resistance, with some city officials arguing that such reforms would tie the hands of law enforcement. The struggle for reform becomes a battleground, and Kai finds himself right in the middle. The police chief finds himself facing intense pressure. Community leaders, city officials, and even fellow officers are demanding different things. He must decide whether to fully support the reform measures or try to weather the storm and hope things settle down. As he wrestles with the decision, he realizes that either choice will come with consequences that will ripple through the department and the city. Kai stands at a crossroads, reflecting on everything he's been through. The support he's received has been overwhelming, but the threats, the pressure, and the toll on his mental health are undeniable. He realizes he needs to decide whether to continue this fight for change or to step back and focus on his personal life and career. Meanwhile, Nolan faces a similarly uncertain future. His suspension could turn into a termination, and he's unsure if he'll ever work in law enforcement again. He reflects on his mistakes, the damage he's caused, and wonders if there's a path to redemption or if he's destined to carry the weight of his choices forever.